All right. Well, thank you, Gwen, so much for offering to finish out a couple of the slides and presentation that you offered to us during our community of practice. Uh, you've already had a chance to introduce yourself, and feel free to add some additional details if you want, but I want to get started so folks can hear the rest of the fantastic presentation that you started with us earlier this week.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me back again to wrap up. There's lots of information that we're working with, and a lot of this work is important to continue. So I appreciate your enabling me to take the time to share this. And I will share my screen, I think, so that we can continue where we left off, which was right after the graphic components, where we've think about those delegated authorities to human or non-human entities in our practical realm and the work that we're doing as planners or environmental scientists or government people who are making these decisions. This is really how it's played out in sort of our day-to-day. And so this typical planning work, I don't know if you guys have participated in theories of change. A couple of years ago, it was all the buzzword, but this is sort of, you come out of planning school or you come out with a master's of science, you come out of an impact assessment training, this kinds of things, this is the typical approach of all of that stuff, is that you want to achieve an outcome in the natural system. Say you want to have clean water in a natural system. And so the outcome of the natural system is a result of the decisions that humans are making to achieve that outcome. So we have, in these theories of change, you have, okay, here we are, and here's the decision point, and here's another decision point, and here's another decision point, and here's how we get to the outcome of clean water. And so in this way, the human decisions are influencing the system outcomes, right? The system outcomes are predicated and determined by those series of decisions that humans are making. On the Indigenous side, usually the approach is that because the systems themselves, i.e. the earth, has the authority, creates its own laws and determines its own outcomes, then the system says water must remain clean. So in the case of the Okanagan, for example, it's like this water says you have certain obligations and ceremonies to ensure that the services I provide and the obligations you've committed to are maintained. So the system itself says I must be clean. The human decisions are then consistent with the system outcome. So you have this complete sort of inverse of thinking about the authority of human decisions in determining system outcomes. So on the non-Indigenous side, you see humans determine system outcomes, and on the Indigenous side, system outcomes determine human decision-making. Right. So this is really this inverse discussion. And when I talked about when people were coming to the table, these sort of dissatisfactory conversations, they're coming from this typical planning theory, typical planning approach and saying, well, should we or shouldn't we impact this water quality? Should we or shouldn't we pollute with whatever, mining effluent? Or should we or shouldn't we keep this water clean? Right. And so the question coming to the conversation was, you Indigenous people, do you think we should keep it clean or not, right? And so all of this work, all of this body of science, all of this knowledge consolidation about the decision to should we or shouldn't we pollute this water body is the point at which those conversations become dissatisfactory. Because on the Indigenous side says, well, the system already has said the decision needs to be consistent with that system outcome. So a lot of the work that we're doing in our conversations today are predicated on these deeply held, these embodied assumptions about the nature of human decision-making, stemming from the original delegation of authority from the God or creator, right? So all of these, the way that we behave and the question we are asking ourselves, why do people come with this belief that they have this authority, is stemming from those systemic and societal structures, which are the framework of all of the assumptions we consider when we're working through these types of conversations. So within ethical space, the conversation is not about should we or shouldn't we pollute this water, or should we or shouldn't we harvest these blueberries, but is it possible to have common goals? How do we reconcile the different approaches of decision making, right? So it's not about that topical or spatial question necessarily, although it could be. It's about all that exploration of assumptions about how you even come to the table, understanding the delegated authority for human decision-making. So that in ethical space, you can see creates these challenges. But this is, I think, the conversation that we need to be having when we're thinking about what are we trying to reconcile? If reconciliation is the resolution of conflict, what exactly do we need to what roots of conflict do we need to excavate to ensure that we're actually getting to the root of the problem, the core of the problem. And for me, this is the question. And so when I'm in conversation now with governments and things like that, being able to articulate that the challenge is not about that particular topic or that particular question, but the challenge is about how we reconcile these systemic worldviews. And so I hope some of this framing that I've presented today begins to help shape those conversations within your relationships. This is called this trajectory of awesomeness, and it's because who doesn't want to be awesome? It's about how to sort of move into prepare for having these good relationships, prepare for that conversation in ethical space, right? Which we talk about really a deep dive into our assumptions and to drawing out what is truly important and what we really need to be understanding when we're thinking through this. So this is just a little schematic which helps say, well, here's how you can think about sort of organizational preparedness. A lot of the conversations between organizational entities and First Nations have been oftentimes the organization coming and saying, oh, we'd love to do this and we're good people and we want to, you know, have your TK and wouldn't it be wonderful and all this kind of stuff, right? And on the Indigenous nations side, it's like, okay, well, gain some fundamental understanding, come prepared to have conversations which then can get to ethical space and be more efficient and effective more quickly. Because a lot of the conversations when you come in unprepared, it's like, oh, we should do these wonderful things. How come we can't just get along, right? And there's all of these issues and all of this history and all of these perspectives, this offering to ethical space, this offering I said today, or shared with you today, is sort of part of this core understanding, right? What are sort of, from my perspective, these deep systemic roots of conflict, which we need to at least understand before we can talk about the resolution of them. So this is sort of the trajectory, right? You have this core understanding. This is sort of the individual behavioral stuff, right? And the individual knowledge acquisition. It's like, okay, how much can I know about the history of the nation, the country, the constitution, colonialism, residential schools, cultural protocols, philosophies, treaties, all of that kind of body of work. And I'm mostly work in Canada, though also in the United States. And there's this idea that, well, there's this bunch of work that's coming together to really support the gaining of knowledge in this realm, right? Like in Canada, we have this wonderful course. It's an online course, free, from University of Alberta, called Indigenous Canada. So it walks you through this sort of core understanding, all the stuff we weren't taught in school. And I know in Canada, it was much, much worse, the exclusion of Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous history, recognition that Indigenous people were even here. It was different than in the States. The States is a little bit better in terms of its obligations to recognizing that history and those treaties. But really, so the core is like really gaining that understanding, so that when you go into community, they're not like, well, just give us our land back, or do you understand the Constitution, or what's a treaty and our treaty obligations and the nation to nation relationship. So you're really getting grounded in that. And then once you kind of built that, then you're looking to your organizational readiness, right? And those of us who are in this facilitation space, this is really my idea of how to help those organizations begin to become prepared for having these conversations. Because yeah, one of the biggest challenges in the work of sort of regional and local governments, and even the provincial governments here in Canada, is that governments come and say, we'd love to work together with you. We have these new mandates to be collaborative or to work together, et cetera, et cetera. And we really want to do that. And the First Nation is like, okay, well, that's awesome. Let's do this. And they're like, oh, no, but we can't. Our policy over here has precluded that, or we don't have enough money, or we can't do that because of this legislation. So this is part of like really understanding what you're trying to achieve, and then the impediments to it and how you rectify those impediments before you head into relationships. So I'll go over that in a moment. And so once you've done your sort of individual core understanding building, the organizational building, this calls it RRRA, is Rapid Reconciliation Readiness Assessment. So you do that work, and then you get into engagement planning. And this is where a lot of people want to start, right? They want to go out into community, they want to meet people, they want to share information, they want to establish relationships, all that good stuff about working together and all that kind of stuff, right? And so the engagement planning component, though, is really about taking seriously the obligations to understand your Indigenous partner, right? Their protocols, their goals, their visions, their limitations, their constraints, their capacity, all of that kind of stuff, right? Their history, their treaties, And so this obligation on the organization and the individuals to truly understand as much as you can before you go into community is really important, because the point of engagement planning in ethical space, like I said earlier, is to develop this common vision, right? To share what we'd like to achieve together, and understanding as much as you can about where the nations are already at with that is really important and creates efficiency, right? And so that's in good. And then once you've done all that work, then, so this would be, the engagement planning is where you would have like an engagement strategy development, this kind of stuff, right? And then my point here is, well, when you sort of done that preparatory work, then you can get into this conversation around ethical space, drawing forward what's important from your organization, from your individual, what those recognizing gaps in knowledge and policy constraints, for example. And then you can bring that into relationship, understanding as deeply as you can what's available to understand about your partner there. You know, and this little triangle at the bottom is this partner readiness. And this is a first version, so there's these little arrows that go back and forth, just to kind of ignore the arrows. So, and then this partner readiness, like this is taking self-accountability and self-responsibility. This doesn't mean that your partner will be ready. You don't know where your partner's at, all of this kind of stuff, right? But you'll find that out in the ethical space-based discourse, right? And create space for whatever place that they're at, right? So that's this trajectory of awesomeness. It's basically just a graphic visual to help think through how we're moving through expanding in preparation for having the most appropriate conversations we can have. So once you've moved through all of these things, then we can get into, so I'll talk now about the rapid reconciliation organizational readiness assessment. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. Okay, so this is this rapid reconciliation readiness assessment, and it's really just a guide to help organizations think through where their energies might be best applied as they grapple with this question of how to better engage with Indigenous people, right? This is really, well, organizations seem to be overwhelmed. They seem to be too eager to get into relationship without having done that preparatory work. And so in terms of the organizational, that second tier of work, it's really thinking through where your energies are best applied, and then where you're at, right? And so this is meant to be quick, that's why it says rapid, and it's really just an assessment within your own organization about your clarity of vision. And I don't mean sort of your whole organizational vision, but there needs to be a vision of reconciliation which is clear to all of the organizational participants, right? And so this could be a separate reconciliation vision, it could be a refined organizational vision, but it's really, how does reconciliation look for your organization? What vision do you have for your longer term working relationship with Indigenous nations going forward? Like a lot of ENGOs are really wrestling with that question, if the criteria is really about how our work as reconciliationists supports the ability of Indigenous people to heal their relationship to their land. Have we articulated what that type of support means within our own organization, right? So a lot of organizations are thinking through this exercise of where do they have a clear reconciliation vision? And this is meant to be sort of a little bit evidence-based, because oftentimes organizations, individuals feel like they have some ideas about what they'd like to see in reconciliation, but then the organization hasn't clarified that consistently. I was working with the province and the land use planning team members here, and the land use planning people are the people who are on the ground, meant to establish the relationships with Indigenous people to advance collaborative resource management and land use planning, right? So we did this exercise with them, and they did not have a clear vision of what they were trying to achieve in reconciliation, even though they were tasked with it. And therefore, then they didn't know what steps, what strategy components they were supposed to do to implement that vision. So they were flying in the dark, trying to have these relationships with Indigenous people, with not knowing what they were trying to achieve, right? And so when we talk about two-eyed seeing, it's being able to have those clear components brought forward into the relationship so you can clarify and negotiate and think through what it would mean to reconcile those visions. But these team members for the province were going around literally blind, right? And so we identified there that they have to work on establishing that vision that guides the entire organization at all of these levels, right? Because they were really untethered throughout the organizational levels to a reconciliation vision. So that was important. And then the X line is just this willingness to an ability to change quickly. If we want to support reconciliation, organizational function is change management sort of. And so how is the organization able to adopt and implement these this reconciliation vision and strategies? What evidence does the organization have that it's been able to do change and move through the implementation of new ideas and strategies effectively? So that's your sort of typical organizational management, right? So the organizations would assess themselves in these, and then in each of these quadrants. And what I'm finding is that typically governments in Canada, at least so far, finding themselves without a vision. And oftentimes they find themselves, as governments typically are, unable to change quickly. And even within this cohort of land use planning team members, it was like this acknowledgement that individuals within the organization are making decisions that are really, people began to question whether those decisions were guided by both hidden and overt bias. So that's still a real interesting challenge. And so over the work that I've done, these assessments, it's become my recommendation that every organization do hidden bias work, right? Because I know in Canada and myself, it took me over 20 years to overcome my own racist attitudes that I had embodied or been indoctrinated with through the school system, for example, and the racist society. And I'm half Indigenous, right? And I work with Indigenous people. My family's Indigenous, and I was questioning, why I was feeling shame at some of these relationships, right? And so, it's that whole notion of intergenerational trauma. I'm feeling shame for my culture because my mom felt shame for the culture because that's what she experienced in her 11 years in residential school, right? And her mom before her. And so, if I'm feeling that, others may not be so aware of sort of that shame, but those biases that are embedded within us need to be excavated. And so my conclusion is essentially, if you were born in, or if you were raised in Canada and the Canadian school system, you are a racist against Indigenous people for sure. The nature of the system left no alternative, right? And so I've been advising, after doing this exercise with a lot of organizations, that they do that work as well. A few organizations, smaller, nimbler environmental organizations, which I work with a lot, sometimes find themselves having declared clear visions, being able to change quickly. And so they are finding themselves, this is sort of the evidence-based approach, that they're in this quadrant 4, sort of ready to advance into engagement planning. And so they have effective relationships, they have respectful relationships, they have mutualistic relationships. And so this is that assessment, because organizations are like, oh, where do we start? This kind of thing, right? And governments often find themselves needing to address that policy suite, right? Sort of this quadrant 2. Okay, well, even if you have this vision of what you'd like to do, you need to get into really describing clearly those impediments which are subjecting your organization to this inability to move quickly or to make these changes, apply these changes. And that's regional governance in particular are like, oh man, we are always in community wanting to do things, and then we are like, oh, we can't do that, or we have to find a way around this policy. And so my assertion here is, well, really take a look maybe at that policy suite and making it consistent with your vision before you go into community and face those hurdles, right? There's a lot of talk, and this comes out in an American context, actually, in the Cascadia Partner Forum, which is sort of this international forum trying to work through the application or the implementation of climate change adaptation strategies across Canada and the United States and British Columbia and Washington State. And so they had done some of that previous work and really thinking through some of their vision. They have principles, they have a sort of a clear idea of what they'd like to do because they did this strategy session. And the most important theme that emerged from there is this idea of centering Indigenous knowledge and leadership within all their work. So it became the preeminent most important goal. It was a strategy, but it's been elevated because that work was viewed as so important that they would have to do that before they could really implement all of these other pillars around salmon restoration and fixing habitat for lynx or stuff like that, right? That this became sort of that overarching visionary component, right? Which is really, really great. But the question is, okay, well, if you want to center Indigenous knowledge and leadership, do you know what that means, and how would you begin to support the achievement of that, right? Because it's one thing to say it, but what does that mean? That knowledge has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Typically, it comes from individuals who happen to have relationships, like some of my friends are knowledge holders in community, and they get called upon to attend all of these meetings, right? And there's good things about that, because their knowledge is now valued, and it does be able to influence certain particular initiatives, say in this case, old growth, right? So that does happen, but what is happening is it's taking the energy and the effort away from the work that I'm arguing needs to happen within community. I talked earlier about the need to codify and articulate Indigenous law, the need to develop the adjudication mechanisms, the need to practice their actual management regimes on the land. All of this type of work needs to be rebuilt, right? Because people are asking for it. And Indigenous knowledge is contained within individuals' knowledge systems, right? And the way that Indigenous knowledge is communicated, is transferred through the generations, all of those systems need to be really supported and rebuilt. And it's difficult to have that process happen when people are being sort of drawn into these other initiatives. And just for context, this is some of the Ministry of Environment initiatives in British Columbia. These are Ministry of Forests initiatives. These are the federal programs. There's all kinds of stuff, fisheries and national parks, et cetera, right? This is all the social and health stuff. And I'm always like, well, a whole bunch of stuff, not my area, but a ton of stuff you can be sure in there. Here are ENGOs, right? Here are municipalities, like everybody wants a piece of this information because of these new mandates, right? The I mentioned before, the moral, the legal, and the environmental imperatives to have this knowledge inform all of these types of things, right? But what ends up happening is I sort of, this analogy, this metaphor is sucking on an empty balloon, right? Everyone is trying to draw into all of these initiatives. And whether or not they're doing it in a way which we critiqued earlier, which was, well, we want your knowledge and we'll subject it to the policy validation loop. Regardless of that type of approach, just the nature of this exercise is sort of not supporting Indigenous communities and rebuilding their knowledge system. One of my colleagues talks about Indigenous communities are in a rebuilding phase. What is that traditional knowledge? How do we pass it on throughout our community and intergenerationally? And then how do we communicate that externally in an effective way? Reg Crowshoe's point of bringing forward what's most important to be understood, that obligation is on Indigenous people. And so for me, a lot of the challenges with government and other entities is this newfound enthusiasm for all things Indigenous and wanting to draw upon it. Indigenous people have been saying for a long time, like, quit siloing and support us to develop our communication and our resources and to practice our ways, right? Even on Monday, the provincial government was coming to a meeting here with me, and they're like, well, tell us your issues, and kind of this like, we'll take care of it approach. Like, tell us, we want to suck out what all of those things are, and sort of we'll take care of it in this particular initiative and stuff like that, right? And they literally said in this meeting, oh, we haven't decided whether we're going to fund you or not for doing that work in the first place. But they wanted to start hearing about all that kind of stuff, right? And it's like, holy smokes, like that's a really inappropriate approach, because First Nations have been saying de-silo and support us to be able to do this work, because once we blow up this balloon, if you will, it'll be a lot easier to be able to communicate those systems of knowledge to these external parties. And so, this concept of when we're trying to, as organizations, center Indigenous knowledge, I think we have an assumption that we're going to be pulling that information out. But what first needs to happen is that balloon needs to get filled. And so the resources have to be applied to the communities to be able to re-articulate some of those things. This is more true in Canada than it is in the States, but I think similarly true, but to a lesser extent in the States, is the need for funding to support these initiatives. Like, I use climate change as an example. In the States, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has been funding climate change adaptation planning within tribal communities for quite some time and continues to do so. There is no equivalent funding on the Canadian side for the development of tribal climate adaptation plans, or it's very, very limited, so limited that I don't even know about what those initiatives would be. So that's one of the big differences, but I think there's still a lot of work to do to be able to consolidate, repractice, and communicate those information. So when people talk about this idea of, oh, we really want to, center Indigenous knowledge and leadership, really think through what's required in that. And it requires this sort of, again, challenging the assumptions about what we think is appropriate and needs to occur, being responsive to Indigenous nations, and taking it upon our collective selves as a set of organizations or governments to think through, are there ways we can support Indigenous communities more effectively? And again, in here, there is a little nuance in terms of the federal government's responsibility to support Indigenous nations. They're more supportive in the States, although not great. It is even worse in Canada. So think about that for a while. It's crazy.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question
Yeah.
on that slide? And this is more of just kind of grounding in terms of what I, and I'm sure other facilitators have heard when we're in those spaces, and federal agencies, nonprofits are seeking traditional ecological knowledge. Like, how do we incorporate it in? And I think what really helps in the way you're framing, I just want to make sure that I'm tracking this right, is that we hear in those dialogues, whether it's forestry, climate change, watershed, tribes are talking about, and tribal representatives and community members are saying, a couple things that I think really resonates with this. And that's, well, what I translate it to is, you can't have traditional ecological knowledge without a partnership and Indigenous people on the ground, right? You can't incorporate TEK into your management without ensuring that those people have access, are part of the stewardship, and that relationship is reconnected. And the way you do that is, what we hear from the tribes is, we need youth programs so that we could teach our children this TEK that you want, and so that we can continue that knowledge base. We need workforce development so we can make sure that our knowledge bearers and the people that have this information have the skills to do the work that you're asking for, so we could be on the ground and have that relationship. We need training on climate adaptation so we can translate that for you, because it's our knowledge that needs to be translated. It's not knowledge we give to you. So these are some of the things that kind of we see in terms of those. I think what you were saying is like filling the balloon, like the specifics that we hear from tribal representatives of what needs to go into that balloon. And I just want to make sure that I'm connecting those dots right in kind of your framework.
Yes, for sure. That's exactly true. So there's two thoughts that I want to make there, and I just jotted them down. So I'll start with the first, and this is interesting. So when we're saying, well, we need people who are Indigenous to tell us those things, right? And we want to draw upon those individuals, say, into an initiative, right? And say, well, we can't do this initiative without sort of respecting the individuals and the community and making sure they're part of the discourse. And this, on one hand, is very true, and we hear this in communities, to say, well, some of my colleagues say, well, not without us, or what is that saying? Nothing about us without us, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so that's really true. On the other hand, I've seen that used as almost an excuse for not thinking through how to be responsive to this agenda, right? So there was a client I was working with on heritage planning, and she was working for this one particular city, and she wrote this heritage management plan, and it was like all of these things and recognizing the history, and we got to this grouping of people who were all non-Indigenous, and most of them non-female, and they were saying, well, we really can incorporate these things because we haven't had an Indigenous member on our heritage climate, or our heritage commission, right? So we really should just not even really bother, was kind of the sentiment. And I said, I don't think that's appropriate, because of firstly, there has 150 years of positioning from First Nations about what they think is appropriate, what needs to change. And I mentioned the Laurier Memorial earlier, and it's like, that's a 110-year-old document, which is an unambiguous policy statement, which states, we're going to share this land half and half. And so this kind of excuse is really like what was the word I used? It's like they're creating this excuse, which is a continued marginalization of Indigenous people within that space, to say, okay, well, and the reason that the Indigenous persons was not in the space is because 90% of the population was decimated by smallpox and hasn't recovered, right? And so they were like this, so this excuse for continued marginalization, which the point that they weren't there was that they had been decimated and they didn't have enough capacity to have those conversations. And so for this organization to say, well, we're not going to listen to all the stuff you've been saying in your history and your documents, your policies, your tribal council resolutions for the past 150 years or X number of years, we're going to say, well, because you're not at the table, we can't do anything with that information, right? So for me, that was like this continued marginalization. So on one hand, you have this not about us without us, very, very true. On this other hand, you say, well, is that an excuse for continued marginalization by this organization? So I would push back and I said, well, I mean, that is a continuation of the colonial oppression, right? And so, because there's a lot of information out there available in literature, just say academic or literature or government information. Information has been provided by First Nations in terms of positions, policy, community dynamics, which are made available to, say, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. All of these reports are from the EPA, for example, about tribal water quality, all this kind of stuff that contains so much information. So if you say, well, you know, all that exists, but we're not listening to it because we don't have a person from the community because we killed them all, you know, then we're okay. So I'm getting a little bit of a rant, but I think that's a very important discussion because the capacity limitations as a result of the population decimation are really critical. So they don't have capacity to sit at this sort of esoteric cultural heritage committee unpaid within their neighboring jurisdiction, in this case, a municipality. And that jurisdiction says, well, we don't have the authority to deal with any of that because we don't have a person there. Is, I think, both the continued colonial assertion of colonial power, as well as this marginalization, right? This justification to continue to marginalize the Indigenous voice. So much information exists. So I thought, well, as an Indigenous person, and knowing the reports that I've written to government on behalf of my clients, you know, there's a lot of stuff that can be drawn upon and reflected upon and be responsive to. And so this is the challenge too. It's like, well, when you go into a community like that, and you say, well, you weren't here, so we don't really want to appropriate any of your, you know, make any assumptions or appropriate, and sort of, i.e. marginalization. You know, as an Indigenous person, you say, well, we just read the history documents that were done by some scholars from the 1950s, and here's, you know, what they were saying, your community was saying, all of these kinds of things, and here's how we were thinking we should be responsive to some of those laws, some of those policy directives, considerations, all that kind of stuff. I think that will go a long way. And I was working with another city, and the fact that they did this, they did a principle-based approach. A lot of cities in Canada are trying to be cities of reconciliation, following a principle-based approach, coming up with visions and strategies to support that notion of reconciliation. So these cities of reconciliation sort of firstly think about this principle-based approach, like, I recognize, understand the significance of you, your community, and your knowledge, right? And then they go into the community, and maybe the community didn't really have a pen on those principles. I help support them, right? But they went into community and say, basically, these principles demonstrate that we understand the significance of the knowledge, we understand that the nature of our historic relationship, and we understand you know, how we're thinking about our obligations moving forward to say UNDRIP, right? And so in that meeting where they presented to these 6 nations, the nations like, oh, you know, we felt heard, we felt supported, that you understood what we've been trying to say for the past X years, right? And then they said, literally, it was about a development project. Let's get down to business, right? Because those perspectives were validated in this principle-based approach, right? So that's what I advocate for. So, but I understand the constraint there for sure, right? So there's always space for Indigenous people, but that's not used an excuse for continued marginalization of the issues that have been brought up innumerably throughout the history. So I was on another call and people are like, well, what do Indigenous people think? You know, what are they saying we should do about climate change? Like, you don't need a $450,000 engagement plan. It's pretty clear. If, for example, quit cutting old growth and caribou habitat. Like, it's been said many, many, many times. I'll sort of shift out of my rant now. I hope that answers your question.
No, I think it's helpful in terms of, in my mind, of helping to clarify that nuance of ensuring that space and that voice is heard and acknowledged, the Indigenous space and is heard and acknowledged, while also being cognizant of history, capacity. One way I've heard it is, you set the table and you leave a seat blank for that Indigenous voice. And because the people can't be there because of capacity or interest, your vision and your outcomes can still say, but we've already been told, they've already shared those lessons with us. How do we bring those into the discussion? And we can continue a feedback loop and double check that we got it right without being appropriative, but at least being a partner and saying,
Yeah.
you've taught us.
Yeah, it's not even like setting the table. It's like your mise en place, if you will, right? When you're preparing a recipe, you put all the ingredients there, right? The recipe's not made yet, but you're ready, right? And so those ingredients include all of those historical perspectives, right? And then you're ready to bake. And so the Indigenous person is not there. They can't be a co-baker, but you can take those ingredients and still make that cake, right? Is it going to be flavored with the appropriate spice at the end? Maybe not, but it's a learning journey we're on as well, right? And so they're not there co-baking, but all of those ingredients, all of those perspectives, the treaties, the nuance of perspectives have been included in the setup of ingredients, that mise en place, they say sort of in French, right? So I think that's an important thing. So it's not even setting the table and leaving this empty plate, but it's more of that interactive baking stuff, right? So
I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good analogy. And then I think the other thing that resonates with what you're saying is also, at least for the work that I've done, part of that vision of like, what is the outcome we want, is that the vision is to ensure that Indigenous people have that access and connection to land, right? That, in California, that's, Indigenous elders have the ability to go on the land and do cultural burns where appropriate. That, tribal people have the ability to go and fish, and that the salmon in the waterways. So we've heard that, we've gotten those statements and various things, but just making sure that as part of the recipe, that end goal and outcome is part of it as well. So I appreciate, thank you. I just wanted to kind of connect the dots with some stuff. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Thanks for the question. Love it. So this is really starting to wrap up here, right? And I talked a little bit about, in response to the question on the last slide, is demonstrating these understandings of the system, that dual authoritative hierarchical framework that we talked about earlier in terms of the authority and how we embody these delegated authorities from the most highest level, the God creator level, right? And one of the points I make in terms of that, when we think about those two different societal structures, right, and God and creator and how it all falls down, right, is that one of the challenges in Canada, the United States probably a little bit less so, but still existing, is this idea that, say, the legal and the religious, the secular, the governmental bureaucracies, they all sort of continuously validate and create this credibility around this approach. Like showing up to a meeting, not having examined the assumptions about where you believe your authority comes from, is a demonstration of this constant validation of this particular system. So I hope through this conversation too, that we've been able to say, well, really, metaphysically, those are two societal structures that emanate from the ether, like the metaphysical ether, right? And as humans, we kind of put them in these God and creator constructs, right? But they're just two examples of the infinite possibilities of societal structure that would be manifest coming from that metaphysical ether. So the point is, they're like, how could you argue one is more valid than the other? And that's what Indigenous people have been saying for the past 150 years too, or 200 or 300, whatever it is, saying, well, how do you get off that your system's more valid? And I hope, this is like, well, how could you argue that one is more valid than the other? It becomes very, very difficult when we begin to think about all of that kind of stuff, sort of from a more objective level, if you will. I'm not suggesting that I'm, uber objective. I have my biases, but if we don't even examine it, we can't begin to think through what reconciliation needs to look like, right? And this is maybe a bit of a different approach in terms of, and I don't want to misspeak here, but when we're thinking about, say, for example, diversity, equity, inclusion, people are like, well, why don't we have more Indigenous people on staff? Or, we're trying to get X numbers, or, all of this kind of idea, right? And I think the more fundamental question needs to be, well, why would Indigenous people want to participate in the validation of that system, which is on this one side, and doesn't recognize and tries to subjugate their own system? So in terms of, the inclusion agenda, even the assumption that people want to be included within that system, I think, is one we have to explore. And it may be different for different segments of society, right? Different peoples who are exploring the need to be more respectful of and inclusionary of. So that's one consideration in terms of that particular nuance, I think, in North America is important. And so this principle-based approach I talked about and gave this example in the city I was working with, like this principle-based approach demonstrates you understand the significance of the knowledge that's being shared with you, that you're understanding, that you're reading about, all of that kind of stuff, right? And these notions of transparency, particularly in that policy realm, the financial realm, super important, not often done well by governments, I have to concede. And then the acknowledgement of capacity and the challenges and supports, like in terms of blowing up that balloon, if you will. My colleague said, we used to have 19 villages and thousands of people performing land management, right? Making sure everyone had enough and was supported, all this kind of stuff. And now we have 4 villages and 600 people. How can we be expected to provide the management direction and application across our traditional land base with these capacity constraints? So we have to be really thinking about that. When I talked about an excuse for continued marginalization, there were thousands and millions of Indigenous people here, and now there are fewer. And so not letting that capacity challenge be an excuse for continued marginalization, but also acknowledgement. How do we support the rebuilding? So one of the things is, well, all of these people in government and other organizations, this notion of secondment, if you will, like if we are truly going to be, if reconciliation is successful following Indigenous law in whole or in part, we need to be getting behind the directives and the management structuring and bureaucracies that need to be built for Indigenous management. And they look different. Sort of Indigenous management and non-Indigenous management, that we can talk about that at some later time. And then of course, the tried and true, trust and time, and really thinking through the notion of relationship as something that in this dynamic is, there's so much conflict, and you guys are the conflict resolution practitioners. I'm actually not, right? And so how do we build the trust to have those hard conversations? And many of you are practiced in this and trained in this kind of stuff, and I'm not. But one of the words I've been reflecting on recently is agonism, right? It's this notion that conflict is not only inherent to the political process, but necessary, and that we don't always have to feel good. We can still make a decision, even if we're not feeling good about it, right? And that it's okay to sort of have these conflicting approaches. And not only is it okay, but it's necessary. It's just something I'm reflecting on in terms of my growth into understanding more deeply some of the work that's required in conflict resolution. So I'll end with this slide, which I really like, which is action has meaning only in relationship, and without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action, right? So you could put any verb in here, conservation or planning or science research. But the point here is that if you don't understand that relationship, your only alternative is conflict, right? Excuse me. And so my point here is that for non-Indigenous people, part of the understanding of relationship is not our interpersonal relationship necessarily, it's part of it, but it's understanding the relationship of Indigenous people to the land. When we talk about the role of the necessity that reconciliation be built upon the healed relationship of Indigenous people to their land, it's imperative, we don't want to have conflict, to understand the whole of that relationship. And when you're in community with Indigenous people and they're talking about loving your Mother Earth and all things are related, and the need to understand those relationships, it's really significant, because if you don't, the only alternative is conflict. So I'll end with that. I really like this. Krishnamurti is, I don't think, an Indigenous North American, but I really like the quote. So thank you very much for being here and for listening. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Gwen, for giving us a little bit more insight into some of the work you've been doing, and appreciate you joining us today.